And Elizabeth, let's start with you. Trip Gabriel. We've been talking about Trip Gabriel's piece this morning. I went through a litany of impeachable offenses off the top of the show. I mean, I could do them again, but I think most other presidents or attorney generals would already have impeachment hearings set up against them. And Nancy Pelosi knows, though, what Trip Gabriel reported, that people in Youngstown, Ohio, and across the upper Midwest are saying, I don't care about his taxes. I don't care if Barr lied before Congress. I don't care about the Russians. I want my job back. That I want, or at least I want the type of job my dad had in Youngstown.
Yeah, the interesting thing, and it's not just people in Youngstown. We've been reporting in other parts of the Midwest, and it is farmers who are being hurt by the president's trade war. But they say, well, you know, I'll take this short-term pain. I'm glad he's standing up to China. So people are not necessarily supporting their economic self-interest. We've seen this before. There's a lot of it's identity politics, and as we have seen, the president has, maintains that 35 to 42% support, regardless of what happens in Washington and regardless of what we talk about in terms of subpoenas, the Mueller report, his taxes, payments to porn stars. It has not really budged in 2.5 years.
They really don't care, Jeffrey Goldberg. It's also an interesting, the Trip Gabriel story also brought out a very interesting contrast between the President of the United States and right now his chief competitor, who is Joe Biden, regarding China. These Youngstown workers and workers across the upper Midwest in America love a president that's taking on China. And yet Joe Biden has said, we have nothing to worry about with China. There seems to be a marked contrast that actually may require Joe Biden to go back and clean that lineup a bit.
Yeah, that wouldn't be the first time he had to go back and clean up a line, although he's been pretty disciplined so far, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's been unusual. Someone who wrote about him for years. I mean, obviously, Joe Biden is acutely aware. I mean, it's always this question, right, about whether Joe Biden is actually the tribune of the white working class, of the white blue-collar male in the upper Midwest. And we don't know for sure how deep that is, but he is acutely sensitive to that image, and I don't doubt that his position on China will evolve if evolution is what is required. I'm not trying to sound cynical there, but I would bet with you that we hear some tougher language when he realizes that this is what people want, and people are no longer trusting of elites when they come talk to them about China and trade policy and free trade.
You know, Willie, the Trip Gabriel piece is so important in the New York Times because I think it struck a chord with a lot of people that actually live in Middle America, have friends in Middle America, have relatives in Middle America. What those people were saying sounds an awful lot like what you and I hear from friends that don't live on the coast, and that is, hey, Trump's a fighter. Yeah, he's not perfect, but guess what? Neither am I, neither are you. You know, I want him in there fighting for me. He has built a pretty strong brand with a large swath of voters in Middle America.
Well, he made a promise in the 2016 presidential election that those jobs that left in the steel industry, in the auto industry, in the coal industry were going to come flooding back to the country. That hasn't happened, which makes this story in the Times today so interesting. In Youngstown, an old steel town, they're still hanging in. They're still patient with President Trump. They want to see what happens. And there's one quote in here, exactly what you say, from a guy who talks about the president being a fighter, a guy who's going to punch back. He said he wants the world to look at him and say, don't mess with that guy. He will get even, says this one man quoted in the piece. So it also reminds me a little, Joe, of what we hear from evangelical Christians who say of President Trump, we didn't elect a saint, we elected a president. So that a lot of people are willing to overlook broken promises, overlook his personal failings that they wouldn't overlook. There's something about this man that gives people the confidence to hang in with him. We'll see if that continues into the 2020 election. Interesting, too, Youngstown, Ohio is about half African American. So it's not just those white working class workers. that we hear so much about in a lot of these pieces, but they're 45% or so of the population in Youngstown is African American. So I'd be interested to see where they stand on the president at this point as well.
So, you know, Mike, it's interesting. Willie brings up evangelical voters. Obviously, so many evangelical leaders are just rank hypocrites. If you take what they said about Bill Clinton in 1998, 1999, 2000, and now what they're saying about Donald Trump in 2017, 18, 19, they are rank hypocrites. But people in the pews do look at the Supreme Court. They look at federal judges, which for evangelical Christians has been one of the driving issues over the past 2-3 decades. And they've hated Republican presidents that got elected and ended up putting moderates in there. So let's move evangelical voters over to the side and say, well, maybe we can explain that away through abortion and other court rulings that are sure to be coming in the next decade or so and before. But with these workers in Youngstown, Ohio, we have seen it time and again, people voting against their economic self-interest. The manufacturing jobs in Youngstown are not coming back.
No.
The other jobs that the mining jobs that Donald Trump is talking about, not only are they not coming back, they're going away. The few high-profile examples, whether it's Carrier or Ford, that even Foxconn that Donald Trump talked about, they've all blown up in his face. The question is, will those voters discover that this billionaire, that this plutocrat is nothing more than the short, fat little man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz? Well, and I mean, you know, this frightening Wizard of Oz, and then there was just this short, fat little
guy
man
shuffling around,
pushing buttons. Will they learn that in time for the 2020 campaign, or does Donald Trump skate to re-election?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, Joe. I do know that the quote that Willie referred to in Trip Gabriel's New York Times piece today was uttered by a guy by the name of Darrell Franks. He's a retired tool and die maker from Youngstown, Ohio. He was once a Democrat. He's now a Republican. And Darrell Franks in Youngstown, Ohio is not alone. You can find a Darrell Franks in central Massachusetts. You can find a lot of Darrell Franks in places like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, throughout the Midwest and on both coasts. So the question is, will they catch up to reality? That is an unanswerable question right now, Joe, because the vast majority of Americans, guess what? They have not read the Mueller report. They don't get up every day and think about Bill Barr and the U.S. District Court ruling and things like that. They have their own lives. They have their own children, their own families, their own livelihoods. And they have, a lot of them, been highly susceptible to the show, to the entertainment factor of Donald Trump. And a lot of them like the language that he employs. They like the swagger. They like the fake tough guy performance up on stage. And whether he'll be unmasked by Joe Biden or anybody else, that remains to be seen. But I think it's a good bet that at some point he will be unmasked, because he is a phony tough guy.
Well, he will be unmasked. The question is when, Mika. And you know, Democrats play into his hand, the media play into his hand. Those people that Mike's talking about, they love seeing Democrats pulling their hair out and being frustrated by Donald Trump's abnormal behavior, abhorrent behavior. They love watching people like us in the media attack and criticize Donald Trump and pulling our hair out over his breaching of constitutional norms. They obviously don't care about constitutional norms. They don't care about Madisonian democracy. They don't care about checks and balances. They don't care that the Attorney General of the United States has lied and committed perjury under oath. They don't care that Donald Trump has attacked federal judges and the independence of the federal judiciary. They don't care that Donald Trump has lied on Air Force One and obstructed justice possibly 10 times of court. They don't care, all right? They don't. You can't make them care. You just can't make them care. That means Democrats are going, or a Republican, they're going to have to beat Donald Trump on the field that matters to these people, and that is jobs, jobs, jobs. That's all it's about for millions of Americans. And you can't blame millions of Americans who are struggling paycheck to paycheck to stay in their home, to pay their rent, to be able to afford maybe to send one of their children off to college.
So, but there is political discipline that's needed as well. They can focus on the issues and be aggressive about the issues, but honestly, the Democratic freakout is the part where Trump will feed into that and take advantage of that chaos. So again, you know, speaking with the Speaker of the House yesterday, that discipline, moving forward, and really having the systems work, check, balance, get the information, move forward, but then watch what the Republicans do. You've got one Republican right now who has broke ranks, one Republican who finally has stepped up and realized that perhaps the truth and the rule of law is more important than identity politics of the moment. There might be more.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.